A nurse is fired for providing emotional support to a terminal patient who has no family. She decides to take drastic measures to ensure that he doesn't spend his final days alone. Emily Turner always knew she was born to care for others. Since she was a child, playing nurse with her dolls, she demonstrated a natural instinct for care and empathy. She grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and people remarked how special young Emily was, always willing to help anyone in need. Her parents, proud of her, watched her transform her talent into a vocation. Years later, upon graduating in nursing, Emily made a silent vow to herself. She would always put the well-being of her patients above anything else. And so, with her impeccable uniform and a serene smile, she began another day of work at St. Mary's Hospital. St. Mary's was an old hospital, with red brick walls and long corridors that carried stories in every corner. It was a place that, despite its austere appearance, pulsed with life and hope. And Emily loved walking through those corridors, knowing every smell, every sound, and she knew that behind each door there was a life waiting for care and attention. However, for many, those same corridors represented loneliness and fear. Emily felt this deeply, and it was this awareness that made her dedicate herself body and soul to her patients. Over the years, Emily stood out not only for her technical skills, but mainly for her ability to see the human being behind each diagnosis. Emily had a presence that emanated calm and security. Her gaze was deep, as if she could see beyond physical pain, reaching the wounds of the soul. Her colleagues admired her, but also viewed her with some perplexity. How did she manage to maintain that level of empathy day after day? For Emily, the answer was simple. She didn't know how to be any other way. Each patient was unique. Each life was precious, and she was determined to make a difference, even if it was just for a brief moment. There was something special in the way Emily spoke to the patients. Her voice was soft but firm, conveying confidence and comfort. She knew exactly what to say to ease fear and bring a little light in the midst of darkness. No matter how busy she was, she always found time to sit by a bedside, listen to a vent, or simply be present. For her, being a nurse was not just a profession, it was a calling, a mission. Working at St. Mary's was not easy. Many times Emily found herself facing life and death situations where the line between success and tragedy was thin, and although she knew she couldn't save everyone, she never stopped trying. She refused to be a passive spectator of others' suffering. It was this determination that kept her going, even on the hardest days when all she wanted was a moment of peace. The day started like any other for Emily, but there was something in the air she couldn't define. After the morning meeting, the head nurse called her aside, with a grave expression on his face. He spoke about a new patient, an elderly man named Robert, who had just been admitted to the palliative care ward. The tone of the head nurse was distant, almost indifferent, as if Robert were just another name on the long list of terminally ill patients. But when he mentioned that Robert had no one, no relatives, no friends, something inside Emily stirred. She felt an urgency to meet him, as if that were the reason she was there. When Emily first entered Robert's room, she found a thin man with a lost look, sunken into snow-white pillows. He was lying down, his face turned towards the window, watching the gray sky outside. The room was small and austere, with nothing that suggested any kind of personality. It seemed like a place of transition, a temporary space. Emily approached cautiously, respecting the silence that seemed to envelop Robert like a cloak. "Good morning, Mr. Robert," she said, her soft voice breaking the silence. Robert didn't respond immediately. He just slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting hers, tired and lifeless. It was during that first meeting that Emily realized the depth of Robert's loneliness. His eyes seemed to carry decades of untold stories, of unshared pains. Emily, with her keen sensitivity, felt the need to break that barrier. She started with the basics, checking his vital signs, adjusting the pillows, but always maintaining eye contact, as if to say she was there for him. "Would you like to talk?" she asked, knowing that often the simple offer to listen was what people needed most. Robert, however, remained silent, his gaze returning to the window. Emily didn't press. She knew that for some patients, accepting help was a slow, almost painful process. She just made it clear that she was available for him at any time. "I'll be here every day, Mr. Robert. If you need anything, I'll be around," she said, while tidying up the room, trying to bring some order to that impersonal space. In the following days, Emily maintained her routine of visiting Robert's room, always with the same gentle approach. Gradually, she noticed small changes. Robert began to react to her questions, with nods or almost inaudible murmurs. One afternoon, while Emily was adjusting Robert's sheets, he finally broke the silence that had hung between them. "You know, I never thought it would end like this," he said, his voice hoarse and tired, but filled with deep sadness. Emily stopped what she was doing and turned to him, surprised and touched that he was ready to talk. "How, Mr. Robert?" she asked, feeling that this was the moment she had been waiting for since the first day. Robert sighed deeply before continuing. "Alone. There's no one. I spent my whole life chasing things that in the end meant nothing." The words came out with difficulty, as if each one weighed tons. Emily felt a lump forming in her throat but held back. This was Robert's moment, not hers. "I'm here now," she said sweetly, trying to convey with her voice all the support he seemed to have lost over the years. The routine between Emily and Robert transformed into something deeper, almost sacred. What started as a simple professional task became an essential part of both their days. Emily felt that with each visit, something invisible but powerful grew between them. One morning, Emily entered Robert's room with a surprise. She brought with her a small plant, a cactus, which she placed by the window. "I thought you might like to have something green around here," she said with a soft smile. Robert looked at the plant, and for a moment, Emily thought he wouldn't react. But then, he raised an eyebrow and murmured, "I've never been very good at taking care of living things, but thank you." It was the first time he had expressed gratitude since she started caring for him, and Emily felt warmth fill her chest. The days passed, and the cactus by the window became a silent symbol of the bond that was forming between them. Emily began to feel that Robert was waiting for her, that her visits were the highlight of his days. She started spending more time with him, even if it meant sacrificing her breaks or staying a little beyond her shift. There was something about Robert that drew her in, a deep pain that she wanted to heal, even knowing that in the end, she couldn't save him from his fate. On a particularly rainy afternoon, Robert finally made a confession that surprised Emily. "You know, I think I've never really thanked you for what you've done for me," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emily, who was tidying up the sheets, stopped and looked at him. "You've been more than a nurse. I feel like I found a friend, something I haven't had in a long time." Robert's words touched Emily deeply. She approached, holding his hand, feeling the fragile and cold skin under her fingers. "I'm here for whatever you need, Robert, always," she responded, feeling a connection that transcended the simple role of a nurse. Once while they were together, Emily brought a special surprise, an apple pie made by her grandmother. She had heard Robert mention that he loved apple pie as a child and decided that he deserved one last memory of the taste of his childhood. As he took the first bite, Robert closed his eyes, letting the familiar taste transport him to simpler times. "I haven't had something like this in decades," he said, his voice choked. "It reminds me of home." Emily smiled, feeling a mix of joy and sadness at seeing the impact that simple gesture had on Robert. As winter approached, the days became shorter and the nights colder. Emily brought extra blankets and made sure Robert was warm. But it wasn't just the physical cold she was fighting. It was the cold of loneliness she was trying to keep at bay. She started bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, an old black and white photo of a snowy landscape that she imagined resembled Robert's childhood. Each gesture, no matter how small, was a way of saying that he was no longer alone, that someone cared. On one of those nights, as the snow began to fall outside, Robert talked about what he hoped for in the end. I just want it to be peaceful, he said, with a calmness that Emily hadn't seen before. And I want you to know, Emily, that your presence here has been the closest thing to peace I've experienced in a long time. Those words, coming from a man facing death with dignity, echoed in Emily's heart. She knew that, although she couldn't change Robert's fate, she had managed to offer him something that even the best medical care couldn't provide: the feeling of being loved, of being important. Until the last breath, winter had fully set in, and the windows of Robert's room were fogged up from the cold intensifying outside. As Emily entered that always quiet space, she noticed a different weight in the air. Robert seemed more introspective than usual, his eyes fixed on nothing as if lost in thoughts only he could access. After a few attempts at conversation and receiving only monosyllabic responses, she decided to try a different approach. She sat next to him on the small sofa in the room and waited, letting the silence speak. It was Robert who finally broke the silence, after long minutes that felt like hours. "You know, Emily," he began, his voice low and hoarse, "there's something that weighs more than the illness. It's the loneliness." The words came out like a confession, filled with a pain that he seemed to have kept hidden for too long. "I spent years isolating myself from people, thinking it was easier that way. Now, I realize I was wrong. In the end, what hurts the most is having no one. I have no one to call, no one to visit me." Emily felt her heart tighten at hearing Robert's confession. She knew that for many, loneliness was a burden greater than any physical ailment. "I'm here, Robert," she said softly, holding his hand firmly. "I know I can't fill all the void, but you're not completely alone." Those words, simple and sincere, seemed to calm a bit of the anguish that dominated Robert. He squeezed Emily's hand in response, as if holding on to a last hope. That was the first time Robert spoke about his life before the illness. He told Emily about his youth, about how he devoted himself to work and gradually lost contact with friends and family. "I always thought there would be time to fix things," he said, with a sad smile. "But time passed, and I didn't notice. Now it's too late." Emily listened attentively, not interrupting, feeling that each word was a confession of regret, an attempt to make sense of a life he believed he had wasted. One afternoon, Robert was particularly down. "You know what's worse, Emily?" he asked, his voice filled with melancholy. "It's knowing that when I go, no one will notice. There will be no one to miss me, no one to cry for me." Emily felt a solitary tear slide down her face, but she didn't let Robert see. She knew his words were true, but she refused to accept that he would leave without leaving a mark, without being remembered. Determined not to let Robert face this reality alone, Emily began to spend more time with him, doing everything possible to fill the empty spaces that loneliness had carved in his soul. "Robert, we all leave a mark on this world, in one way or another," she said, holding his hand. "And I will remember you. I promise your story won't be forgotten." Robert looked at her with gratitude, and for the first time, a small smile appeared on his face, a smile that said more than 1,000 words could express. The corridors of St. Mary's Hospital were always busy, but behind the frenetic pace, the watchful eyes of the administration let nothing go unnoticed. The cameras installed in the common areas and the regular rounds of the supervisors ensured that each nurse and doctor strictly followed the established guidelines. However, in recent months, a name began to frequently appear in the administrators' conversations: Emily Turner. Comments about the time she spent in Mr. Roberts' room, the extended visits, and the care that went beyond what was expected started to attract attention. Initially, they were just murmurs, small observations that seemed harmless. "She's getting too involved," someone commented in a senior staff meeting. One day, during a meeting with the nursing team, the head nurse, a woman known for her rigidity and unwavering commitment to the rules, made a direct observation. We've received feedback about the need to maintain a professional distance from our patients, especially in the palliative care unit, she said, without directly mentioning Emily, but making it clear to everyone who she was referring to. Remember, we're here to provide medical care, not to get emotionally involved. The discomfort in the room was palpable. Some nurses exchanged nervous glances, aware that the words were directed at Emily, who was present. Emily, for her part, remained silent, her face serene, but her heart racing. She knew her actions were being watched, but she couldn't ignore the connection she felt with Robert. To her, he was not just another patient. He was a human being who needed more than just medicine and tests. While discussions about Emily continued to simmer in the administrative corridors, she continued her routine, oblivious to the turmoil she was causing behind the scenes. For her, every minute spent with Robert was precious, and nothing, not even the disapproval of her superiors, would stop her from offering him what she believed was the care he deserved. It was a cold morning when Emily was called to the head nurse's office. The invitation was made with unusual formality, which immediately made her heart race. Walking through the corridors, she felt the eyes of her colleagues following her, full of silent concern. When she entered the room, she was met with the serious and distant expression of the head nurse, a woman of rigid posture, with her hair always tied in an impeccable bun. The room was cold, and the air seemed denser than usual. "Emily," began the head nurse, folding her hands on the desk, "it's clear that your dedication to the patients is admirable, but unfortunately, your attitude towards Mr. Robert has crossed the boundaries of what we consider professional." The words were sharp, delivered with the precision of a scalpel. Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the warning that was about to come. She knew this moment would come, but that didn't make the words any less difficult to hear. The administrator, who was also present, intervened next with an even firmer tone. "We have protocols to follow, and these guidelines exist for a reason. When you become emotionally involved with a patient, you risk compromising your clinical judgment. This is not only dangerous for you, but also for the patient and the integrity of the hospital." Emily felt a knot in her throat. She understood the rules, but she couldn't accept that caring for someone had to be so tightly controlled. "I understand," Emily responded, trying to maintain her composure. "You need to remember, Emily," continued the head nurse, "that the role of a nurse is to provide medical care. Empathy is important, but personal involvement cannot exceed certain limits." Her voice was a mixture of frustration and disapproval. Emily slowly nodded, but the flame inside her, the one that drove her to care for Robert so personally, continued to burn. She felt she was being asked to distance herself from something that was intrinsic to her nature. After the meeting, as she walked back to the palliative care floor, the harsh words still echoed in Emily's mind. Each step seemed heavier than the last. How could she move forward, knowing that the simple act of comforting a dying man was seen as a mistake? When she reached Robert's room, she found him sleeping, his face serene amidst the turmoil unfolding around him. Seeing him, Emily felt her internal resolution strengthen. She couldn't simply walk away. She knew that, as important as guidelines were, there were times when humanity needed to surpass bureaucracy. Robert deserved more than cold and distant care, and Emily was determined to give him that. Robert's health was rapidly deteriorating, and Emily noticed he had less and less strength. Even so, she refused to let him face that end alone. One afternoon, as the sunlight softly filtered through the curtains, Emily suggested something that surprised Robert. "How about a walk to the garden, Robert? Some fresh air might do you good." Robert looked at her with tired eyes, but after a moment, he nodded. It was a small desire he didn't know he still had, but that Emily, with her sensitivity, noticed before he could even express it. Taking Robert to the garden was a difficult task, but for Emily, the effort was worth it. With the help of a wheelchair, she slowly guided him through the corridors to the small garden at the back of the hospital. The air was cold, but there was something refreshing about being in contact with nature. Robert took a deep breath, feeling the scent of flowers and the freshness of the wind. "It's beautiful here," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. Emily just smiled, standing by his side in silence, knowing that this moment was a gift she would never forget. From that day on, Emily made sure to create more moments like that. She read to Robert stories he loved, brought small pieces of chocolate that he could slowly savor, and even managed to convince a nurse to play the piano in the hallway near Robert's room, a soft melody that echoed to where he could hear. These moments were small, but for Robert they meant the world. They were proof that he hadn't been forgotten, that there was still someone who cared. Each of these gestures, no matter how small, carried deep meaning for both of them. Emily knew that Robert's hours were numbered, and each passing day seemed a bit shorter than the last. Even so, she didn't let despair take over. Instead, she focused on making every moment count as if it were the last. And, most of the time, Robert returned her effort with a grateful look, a shy smile, or simply holding her hand more tightly. Even as Robert's body failed, his connection with Emily remained strong. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Emily," he said one night, his voice weak and broken. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this." Emily held his hand, feeling tears threaten to flow. "You don't need to thank me, Robert. Being here with you is what matters." And so, they remained, connected by something that transcended words and that, even in the face of death, continued to bloom. When Emily entered the room, she realized something was wrong. The director was accompanied by the head nurse and a representative from the Human Resources Department, all with closed and serious expressions. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, laden with palpable tension. "Emily, we have decided that your recent conduct with patient Mr. Robert has violated the hospital's guidelines," began the director, without preamble. "Although we understand your compassion, it is unacceptable for a healthcare professional to cross the established boundaries. We cannot tolerate this kind of behavior." The words were harsh, but they were delivered with calculated coldness, as if they had already been rehearsed countless times before that moment. Emily felt the ground open beneath her feet, but she kept her composure, trying to absorb the impact. The head nurse, who had always been a figure of authority for Emily, seemed more uncomfortable but did not intervene. He only lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact, as if he knew he was witnessing an injustice, but was unable to prevent what was happening. "You will be immediately dismissed for just cause," the director continued, each word a final verdict. "Your belongings have already been collected, and we ask that you leave the hospital today." Emily stood still, shock taking over her body, as the words echoed in her mind. Emily tried to argue, her voice coming out trembling but determined. "I was only trying to help a man who was alone and dying. I never imagined I would be punished for caring for someone with dignity." The director, however, showed no compassion. "That's not the issue, Emily. The rules are there to be followed. What you did was cross professional boundaries, and that is unacceptable at St. Mary's." She knew that any further attempt to defend herself would be in vain. The decision had already been made. The representative from the Human Resources Department, a thin man with a bored appearance, handed her a folder with the termination documents. "You have the right to contest the decision, but that will not change your current status," he said mechanically, as if reciting a shopping list. Emily didn't respond. She felt as if each word they said was another nail in the coffin of what she believed to be her calling. Emily left the office in silence, feeling the stares of her colleagues as she walked through the corridors one last time. The whispers were inevitable, but she ignored them, focused only on reaching Robert's room. Upon entering, she found him asleep, unaware of the storm unfolding around him. Emily sat beside him, watching his slow and irregular breathing. She knew she needed to tell him, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. Finally, while holding Robert's hand, Emily felt the tears silently run down her face. "Robert," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "I'm not going to leave you." When Emily left the hospital, the reality of her situation finally hit her with full force. The cold winter air seemed to seep into her bones, but it wasn't just the weather that made her shiver. The security she had known, the daily routine of caring for patients, all of it had been ripped from her in an instant. Now she was alone, without a job, without a clear plan, and what hurt the most, knowing that Robert was also alone, facing his final days without the emotional support she had provided him. Each step she took away from that hospital seemed harder than the last, as if she was leaving behind a part of herself. She couldn't stop thinking about Robert, about how he would wake up the next day without knowing that she wouldn't be there to hold his hand, to comfort him with her kind words. The thought of Robert being alone, perhaps already noticing her absence, ate away at her. Emily knew that he had no one, and the idea of leaving him to die in solitude was unbearable. In the darkness of her thoughts, an idea began to take shape. An idea that at first seemed impossible, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. "I can't abandon him," she whispered to herself, as if the words needed to be said aloud to gain strength. Emily knew that what she was considering was extreme, but in her heart there was no other option. She had to get Robert out of the hospital, take him to a place where she could care for him with the dignity and love he deserved. And that place could only be her own home. The loneliness he so feared would not consume him as long as she could do something about it. Emily got up from the couch, her heart racing, but with a new determination. She would need to plan everything carefully, but she was willing to face any consequences. The next morning, Emily returned to the hospital, this time as a visitor. It was strange to walk through the corridors knowing that she no longer had the right to be there, that each step could put her at risk. She found Robert awake, his expression confused and worried when he saw that she wasn't in uniform. "Emily, where have you been?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with an anxiety that broke her heart. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back." Emily took a deep breath, sitting beside Robert's bed. "I left, Robert. They didn't want me to stay here anymore," she confessed, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "But I'm not going to leave you. I want you to come with me, to my house. There, I can take care of you. It won't be easy, but I promise you won't be alone." The words came out with difficulty, but they were sincere. She knew there was no other way to say it. Robert looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to understand the depth of what she was offering. "You would do that for me?" he asked, almost incredulous. Emily simply nodded, holding his hand firmly. "I would," she replied, feeling the courage grow within her. "Well, leave here together, Robert. You deserve to spend your last days with someone who cares." And so, the decision was made. Emily knew the journey would be difficult, but nothing mattered more than being by Robert's side until the end. The first few days after bringing Robert to her home were a mixture of relief and tension for Emily. The small house, which once seemed spacious and quiet, now felt strangely full, as if the weight of the decision was present in every corner. Emily organized the guest room as best she could, transforming it into a cozy and comfortable space for Robert. She hung light curtains on the windows to let in soft light, put clean sheets on the bed, and brought some flowers from the garden, trying to create an environment that would bring him peace. But as the days passed, the reality of her new life began to impose itself. Emily no longer had a steady income, and the savings she had put aside quickly began to dwindle as she bought the medicines and supplies Robert needed. Each trip to the pharmacy was a painful reminder that time was against them, not only because of Robert's condition but also because of their financial situation. The nights she once spent awake worrying about the well-being of her patients in the hospital were now consumed by silent calculations of how long they could hold on before the money ran out. In addition to the financial difficulties, Emily also faced a drastic change in her daily routine. Taking care of Robert was a constant job, and she knew she couldn't afford to hire help. Her days were filled with tasks ranging from administering medication and monitoring his vital signs to preparing nutritious meals and, most importantly, being by his side during the most difficult moments. The exhaustion accumulated, but Emily never complained because she knew that every second by Robert's side was precious. However, the decision to take Robert into her home did not go unnoticed by the community. Neighbors began to talk, some with genuine concern, others with cruelty disguised as curiosity. The occasional visits Emily used to receive became less frequent, and she could feel the weight of judging eyes every time she stepped out onto the street. The small town, which once was her safe harbor, now seemed full of eyes watching her every move, questioning her sanity and intentions. Robert, for his part, felt like a burden, something he expressed in moments of vulnerability. "You didn't have to do this, Emily," he would say, his voice weak but laden with remorse. "I don't want to be a burden to you." Emily always responded the same way, holding his hand and looking into his eyes with firmness. "You are not a burden, Robert. I'm here because I want to be. That's what matters." Even so, the pain of seeing his suffering and the constant struggle to keep the house and Robert's health in order deeply affected her. Despite all the difficulties, there were also moments of rare beauty and connection that Emily would never forget. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, they sat together on the porch where Emily had placed a wheelchair for Robert. They watched the sky, tinged with orange and pink. In silence, a scene that seemed to exist outside of time. Robert, with his heavy breathing, murmured, "It's a beautiful place to say goodbye, isn't it?" Emily felt tears forming but held them back, squeezing his hand. "We still have time, Robert. Let's enjoy every second." Time seemed to pass with a strange mix of urgency and slowness in Emily's small house. Each day was a battle, but also a victory, because they were together. During one particularly quiet night, Robert began to speak. His voice, already weakened by the advancing illness, carried a weight that Emily immediately recognized as a desire to finally free himself from a burden. "I never talked about my family with you, Emily," he began, his eyes lost somewhere beyond the darkness of the room. "Maybe because talking about it would mean facing all my regrets." Emily, sitting by the bed, held his hand firmly but was in no hurry to interrupt what Robert needed to say. She knew he had been carrying a deep sadness since she met him, but she never imagined that the roots of that pain could be so old. "I had a family," he continued, his tone heavy with a melancholy that seemed to transcend time. "A wife and a daughter. But I lost them, not because life took them from me, but because I distanced myself." The words seemed heavy, each one a stone that Robert was removing from within himself and placing in Emily's view. He recounted how in the early years of his marriage he was a dedicated man, but over time, he let himself be consumed by work, ambition, and the desire for success. "I became someone who put work above everything else," he confessed, a solitary tear rolling down his wrinkled face. "And one day, when I realized it, they were gone. My wife got tired of waiting for a man who was never there and took our daughter away." Emily felt her heart tighten as she listened to Robert's story. She knew that this confession came from a place of deep regret, something he had probably carried with him for decades. "Did you never try to find them?" she asked softly, though she already sensed the answer before he spoke. Robert slowly shook his head. "I tried, but it was too late. They moved on, and I was left behind, stuck in my choices, in my own pride. After a while, I gave up. I thought it would be better that way." The silence that followed was filled with emotion. Emily could feel the weight of Robert's past, as if each word he spoke was taking a piece of his soul. "Robert," she began, her voice filled with tenderness and a new determination, "you don't have to carry this alone. Maybe there's still a chance to make things right, to find those you lost." Robert looked at her, his eyes tired, but with a glimmer of hope she had never seen before. "I don't know, Emily," he replied, hesitant. "After so much time, I don't know if they even remember me." But the seed of the idea had been planted, and Emily knew that this was a chance they could not pass up. "You'll never know if you don't try, Robert, and I'm here with you. Let's find your family if that's what you want," she said, with a conviction that made Robert squeeze her hand a little tighter. For the first time in a long time, the idea of finding his lost family didn't seem so impossible to Robert. The painful memories he had held onto for so long now had a new perspective, that of a possible reunion, of one last opportunity to fix the mistakes of the past. In his fragility, Robert began to share more details of his life, stories about his daughter, whom he remembered as a sweet and lively child, and about his wife, a strong woman who loved him deeply but could not bear his constant absence. When Robert finished telling his story, the silence that followed was heavy, but not oppressive. Emily felt that something deep had changed within Robert. He seemed relieved to finally share the burden he had carried for so many years. However, along with the relief came a new restlessness. Emily knew that Robert deserved more than just reconciling with his past. He deserved a chance to reunite with his family before it was too late. The desire to fix what he believed to be irreparable had ignited a new flame in his heart, and Emily was determined to help. In the days that followed, Emily began to plan the possibility of reuniting Robert with his daughter and his wife. She knew it would be a monumental task, but she couldn't ignore the impulse that guided her. Each time she looked at Robert, she saw how much the hope of this reunion meant to him, even if he didn't admit it out loud. "Robert," she said one afternoon while preparing tea, "I think we should try to find your daughter. I know it may seem impossible, but if there's a chance, we need to take it." Robert initially hesitated. The fear of facing his daughter's judgment and the possibility of rejection were overwhelming. "Emily, what if she doesn't want to see me? What if she doesn't remember me? Or worse, hates me for what I did?" His words were laden with anguish, but Emily, with the calm that always characterized her, responded with gentle firmness. "Robert, you'll never know if you don't try. And what if she feels like you, wishing for one last chance at reconciliation? You deserve that opportunity. And so does she." The idea of a reunion began to take shape in Robert's heart. Despite his doubts, there was a spark of hope, something he thought he had lost forever. "I can't do this alone," he finally said, his voice trembling but determined. "Would you help me, Emily, to find my daughter?" Emily smiled, moved by his trust in her. "I won't let you go through this alone, Robert. We'll do this together, one step at a time." With this decision, a new energy took hold of the small house. Emily began organizing the information Robert gave her, trying to piece together a plan to track down his daughter. The stories Robert shared with her about the girl's childhood, the few happy memories and the pains of separation became guides for this journey. Emily knew time was limited, but she was determined to give Robert this last chance for redemption and peace. The anxiety was palpable. Every time the phone rang or when the mailman left something at the door, Robert and Emily exchanged looks filled with anticipation. The hope, which once seemed so distant, now united them in a silent mission. They knew the road would be difficult and the outcome was uncertain, but the simple act of trying was, for both of them, a form of healing. Emily was willing to do the impossible to ensure Robert didn't leave with regrets. Emily knew that time was her enemy. Robert was becoming more fragile, and she could see in his eyes the exhaustion of someone carrying a burden too heavy. But there was also a new flame of hope, one that Emily was determined to keep alive. Determined to find Robert's daughter, she began investigating. She spent sleepless nights combing through old records, trying to trace the story of the family Robert had lost. Each clue she found led to a dead end, but Emily refused to give up. The search was complicated. Robert, in his confusion, only remembered fragments: his daughter's name, which might have changed when she married, and some vague memories of the last place they lived together. Emily started calling public record offices, trying to track down any name or address change. With each call, the tension grew. As vague or even non-existent as the answers were, she persisted, feeling that each new attempt brought her a little closer to her goal. On one of those exhausting days, Emily received a call that brought a glimmer of hope. A clerk at the registry office mentioned that he had found a marriage record that might be Robert's daughter, but there was little additional information. Emily knew she couldn't afford to ignore this lead. She made more calls, connected with people who might know more, and gradually began to paint a clearer picture. Robert's daughter had moved several times, and tracking down all the locations was a challenge. But each new piece of the puzzle brought her closer to the conclusion she so desired. The investigation was not just a task for Emily, it was a race against time. Robert was aware that she was trying to find his daughter, And although he maintained a calm facade, Emily could see the nervousness in his eyes. Each day that passed without news was another layer of doubt that accumulated in his heart. "What if we don't make it, Emily?" he asked one night, his voice weak and full of fear. Emily held his hand tenderly. "We'll make it, Robert. I promise I won't stop until we find her." Finally, after weeks of tireless research, Emily got what seemed to be a solid lead. She found the address of a woman with a name that matched what Robert remembered. The woman lived in a city several hours away, but the hope that this generated in Emily was enough to dispel all the accumulated fatigue. She knew there was still a chance that this lead would lead to nothing, but the prospect of finally finding Robert's daughter filled her with renewed determination. With a racing heart, Emily made the trip to the city, each mile bringing a mixture of hope and fear. When she arrived at the address, her hands trembled. She knocked on the door, waiting, praying that someone would answer. Each passing second felt like an eternity. When the door finally opened, Emily found herself face to face with a woman who could be Robert's daughter. Time seemed to stop as they studied each other, the surprise in the woman's eyes being replaced by a caution that Emily understood well. Emily explained who she was, speaking with an open heart, trying to convey the urgency and sincerity of her mission. The woman listened in silence, her eyes shining with a mixture of conflicting emotions. When Emily mentioned Robert, the woman turned pale, as if the past had returned to haunt her. "I never thought I'd hear that name again," she said, her voice trembling. Emily knew she was facing a delicate choice. She needed to convince this woman to come back with her, to give Robert the chance for redemption he so desperately sought, but that would depend on a single decision, which only she could make. The day of the reunion arrived like an unexpected blessing. Emily felt the weight of the responsibility and hope accumulated in her heart as she helped Robert prepare. He was weaker than ever, but there was a flame in his eyes, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that only heightened the atmosphere of expectation. Emily could hardly believe that after so much effort, they were about to witness a miracle, a reconciliation that Robert had never thought possible. The clock seemed to move slowly, each second carrying an eternity. The doorbell rang and the sound echoed through the house, laden with a solemnity that made Emily's heart race. Robert looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. "Are you ready?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm. Robert nodded, but Emily knew he was bracing himself for the emotions that awaited him. She opened the door, and there she was, the woman Robert had long imagined and feared meeting again. It was his daughter, older and marked by time, but still carrying the face he remembered now with an expression of uncertainty. The moment Robert and his daughter's eyes met was like the shattering of invisible barriers. For a moment neither knew what to say, as if the words they had accumulated in their minds for years simply weren't enough. Emily remained silent, watching, feeling the weight of the past that hung between them. Robert finally broke the silence, his voice weak, but filled with a sincerity that brought tears to his daughter's eyes. "I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a day," he said, each word coming out with difficulty but carrying decades of pain and regret. Robert's daughter took a step forward, tears streaming freely down her face. "I waited so long for this moment," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "But I thought it would never happen." The distance between them was broken as she approached the bed, holding her father's hand for the first time in years. The silence that followed was filled only with the soft sound of both their tears, a current of emotions that spoke louder than any words could express. Time seemed to have stopped, and the outside world ceased to exist, giving way only to the reunion of father and daughter. Emily watched the scene, feeling tears forming in her own eyes. The moment she had fought so hard for with so many obstacles had finally arrived. Robert, who had often doubted himself, now saw before his eyes the proof that the love he believed he had lost was still there, intact, despite everything. His daughter knelt beside the bed, holding Robert's hand tightly, as if she wanted to make up for all the lost time in a single touch. In the minutes that followed, Robert and his daughter shared words of forgiveness and love, the connection between them being restored like a river that, after years of drought, finally finds its course. Robert's voice, though weak, carried a peace that Emily had never heard before. He looked at Emily, his eyes full of gratitude, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me this chance." Emily just smiled, feeling a wave of emotion that couldn't be expressed in words. She had fulfilled her promise, and the miracle she had fought for was before her eyes. The afternoon passed in a flow of soft conversations, timid laughter, and many tears. Robert's daughter told stories of her own life, stories he had missed but now listened to with reverent attention. Emily watched everything with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that regardless of what the future held, that moment of reconciliation would be eternal. When night fell, Robert's daughter stayed by his side, holding his hand, while Emily discreetly withdrew, giving them the space they needed to enjoy the time they had left. The morning Robert passed away was almost supernaturally peaceful. His daughter was by his side, holding his hand, and Emily was nearby, observing in silence, respecting the sacred space of this final goodbye. Robert passed in peace, surrounded by the love that for so long he believed he had lost. After Robert took his last breath, the silence in the room was deep and filled with meaning. Robert's daughter wept, but her tears were not only of sadness. There was also a certain peace in them, an acceptance that, despite everything, they had found the closure they both needed. Emily, though she felt her heart heavy, knew she had fulfilled the mission she had taken on. Caring for Robert until the end, and ensuring that he didn't leave alone, had been her greatest achievement, and she felt grateful to have been a part of this moment. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. The funeral was simple but touching, with few people present, but each of them marked by the story of love, forgiveness, and redemption that unfolded in Robert's final days. His daughter, who had now reconnected with her father, thanked Emily in a way that words could never fully express. "You gave my father the most precious gift anyone could give," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You gave him the chance to leave in peace, knowing he was loved." Robert, who came to her as a lost and lonely man, left surrounded by love and forgiveness. And this transformation wasn't only his. Emily felt that, in some way, she had also changed. The story of Robert and Emily began to spread, touching the hearts of many. People who had never met them personally were inspired by Emily's dedication and the idea that everyone, no matter how broken or lonely, deserves to be cared for with dignity until the end. Emily began receiving letters and messages from people who wanted to share their own stories, from nurses who felt inspired to follow in her footsteps, and from families who found comfort in knowing that compassion still exists in a world that is often cold. Robert's legacy was not limited to the walls of the small house where he spent his last days. It lived on in Emily's transformation and in the lives of all who heard his story. Emily, now more than ever, understood that caring for someone is not just a responsibility but a privilege, an opportunity to touch lives in deep and lasting ways. What she and Robert shared was a bond that transcended time, proof that in the end what really matters is the love we leave behind. As she sat alone in the house that now seemed a little emptier, Emily didn't feel sadness, but deep gratitude. She had done something that few have the courage to do: follow her heart, even when the world around her said it was madness. And by doing so, she not only changed Robert's life, but also her own. The love and compassion she offered him were, in fact, a reflection of what he brought to her life. And with that, Emily knew that no matter what came next, Robert's legacy would continue to live on through every act of kindness she, and others inspired by his story, practiced. If you enjoyed Emily and Robert's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to keep bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next Emotional Chronicle.